get started. So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our LiPS presentation. And our speaker today is our own professor, Anthony Vanky, assistant professor at Columbia GSAP and affiliate with Columbia Data Science Institute. My name is Anna Demina. I will be moderating the session today. As usual, a couple of brief logistical announcements. We are recording today's lecture, so please keep this in mind if you don't wish to be recording. After the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. We will start our Q&A around 2 to 15 p.m. and we'll have enough time for everyone's questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will have a conversation and you'll have a chance to ask a question afterwards. So I'm very delighted and excited to introduce our speaker for today. So Anthony Vanky is an assistant professor at Columbia GSAP, trained as an architect, urban designer, and city planner. His research focuses on civic engagement, urban data, and digital methods, and technologies in shaping and evaluating urban environments. It spans the disciplines of urban design, urban technology, and computational social science. Anthony has previously held appointments in urban planning and technology at the University of Michigan and urban design at the MIT. During that time, he helped build innovative practices within the academy, including the University of Michigan's first of its kind urban technology degree, MIT's Design X program, an entrepreneurship accelerator for design, city, and built environment, and Sensible City Lab, where he was a research and partnership lead. So please welcome Anthony Vanky.
I feel like the pressure is much higher here because I know many of you, some of you are my colleagues, and some of you haven't taken classes with yet. So like if you hate this lecture, you're probably never going to come to any of my electives. So there's a lot of pressure. Also, happy spring. That's why I put the emojis. I want to start with this. This photo was taken around 1985, 1986. You can try to age me in that way. And the reason why I wanted to put it in is that I want to invert how we see each other. Oftentimes, so I actually challenged Anna like 10 seconds before she gave the thing. It's just like, why don't you just introduce me based on how you know me? But oftentimes when we give these talks, the ritual is we give you kind of a narrative version of our resume, and it becomes quite dry, and you know me only professionally. But I think if we can invert how we see each other, I think it opens up new perspectives. In this photo, as I said, 1985, 86, I'm an only child. As you can see, I've grown up with technology. I'm a nerd. I'm an urbanist. All of you know both of those facts. I'm someone's partner. I'm someone's son. I'm a dog daddy. That kid there wanted to be a Disney Imagineer when he grew up, and he never thought that he was going to be an academic or talking to you all. And the reason why I say this is that I think if we think about the data we produce, so the knowledge we have, it sets us on a certain path. And especially when we think about urban data, it tends to be focused on this. So this is from a lot of academic papers that I've mined for the sake of making fun of them. And it seems like every time we look at a paper that's using a brand new urban data set, they will somehow help urban planners make better decisions. And what are the better decisions they think we're going to solve? Traffic. We'll always solve traffic somehow, as if that's the only thing. And in a way, this is like what I'm working against. It's kind of like, some would say, determinism with technology. Some would say kind of, optimization. But if you think about how we understand the world, so these two are homunculi or homunculuses. And what it's a representation of is how much of our brain is dedicated to our sensory experience. So the first one, a classic one is that because our five senses, are so important to how we experience our daily lives, those sense aspects of our body, our hands, our eyes are enlarged, our tongue, taking up actually a remarkably large percentage of our brain. But as we kind of become digitally integrated, cyborgs, perhaps we become the smartphone homunculus, that we become reduced. And I think that that's both worrisome, and that's not maybe the vision that I have. And I think because I'm a nerd, I think there's a chance for us to move away, to fork that timeline, to think about other perspectives and how we think about data, how we think about technology, particularly towards measurements that maybe we may care more about. So I find incredible inspiration from cities that are trying to measure their city productivity in other ways. I was at the University of Michigan for a couple of years, and since the 1970s, they produced the Consumer Sentiment Index. That's a bunch of economists, talking about how happy you are, how confident you are, not through your spending, not through the dollars, but how confident do you feel? Now, yes, that's working towards a capitalist model of, ever increasing consumption, but maybe we can also think about happiness. Bhutan has long prided itself for a variety of reasons on the state of happiness and optimism of its population. American cities are doing the same, so this is not a boutique niche thing. The city of Seattle has been doing this since 2010. The city of Somerville, Massachusetts has been doing something similar in measuring their vitality, not through the dollars spent or their jobs produced, but how the people feel. And I think at the same time, if we think about the trends in technology, yeah, we're getting nicer smartphones. They'll cost ever more money with more capabilities. NVIDIA just kind of overtook Alphabet and Amazon because it's processing power. If you're an investor, great. But I think the other trend is that the technology is becoming more diffuse, not just in the environment, but also in society. So the one on the left is from a startup from a good friend of mine who's creating tools to teach computational skills using non-screen-based technology. So can you teach a child binary using wooden blocks? And kind of the sound of wood hitting wood when you're actually counting up and explaining why certain values are the way they are, to the Arduino Lily pad opening up computation to new populations, really embedding itself in craft, into seniors, into crafts that are traditionally of women or children, of girls, right? Saying that computation is not solely a masculine thing, but it's now actually something that could be available to everyone. So to take it back to urbanism, Peter Drucker from the business world has kind of variations on a quote that's often ascribed to him. In truth, none of them actually, he never said those words, but the idea of what gets measured gets managed. We measure what we care about, and we make improvements on those things that we care about. But in some cases, what we measure is not maybe the way, that doesn't reflect the ways that we actually care or how we should see the world. So how do we move into other paradigms? How do we, in our world, think urbanistically? What are the urban measurements? How do we challenge the tools that are available to us? Or how do we open up opportunities using them in different ways while centering them towards things that we care about as urbanists? How do we maybe create the tools that we actually care about? Stop bitching and whining about how something's extractive and make something for once, right? Like, we have the ability to make the tools, and we have the ability to make data that we care about. So how many times have we complained about how biased a data set is? And how often have you actually made a data set that counters that? Real question in this room. Now I'm on a rant. How many of you have actually produced data that you care about towards something that you care about? Right? So, but how many of you don't have to share your hands for this. How many of you complain about a data set that's available? Right? How often in our classes do we talk about bias in data and do nothing about it? So this is maybe, kind of the moral of the story is like reframing what it is and an invitation to author things, to make things, to break things, to hack things, to put ourselves in the role of authors and equals to those who are making the tools. Getting off of my high horse for a second. So the structure of this talk is going to be a little loose. I'm going to talk about a lot of projects, and maybe there's a stream in there, some cohesive narrative, and something I'm definitely gonna have to work on when I come up for tenure and all of that. But the academics laugh and the PhDs chuckle. So maybe take a big step back, partially because I'm going to talk about imagery a little bit. So a couple of years ago, I was looking out the window, and I'll talk about it more in detail. But that really kind of opened the ideas how to think about images as data. And yeah, it's hot now with computer vision. At one time, computer vision was hard, and it took a lot of struggles. Now it's easier. But for urbanists, photos have been data for an incredibly long amount of time, since the beginning. The famous kind of anecdote from the Boulevard du Temple of one of the first daguerreotypes. I'm saying that wrong because they don't speak French, but that in one of these early kind of images, the recording of people in space, the only things that appear of humans are a man and a shoe shiner. The reason is that when you take one of these images, it takes so long, people moving through the space and the horses, don't get captured. But the fact that you can record an activity that stayed there becomes an impression, almost ghostly, of what Paris looked like, of the activity, at the turn of the last century. Too, kind of all of you in this room should be very familiar living in New York of Jacob Riis, using images of the tenements and how people use as a space to open up for advocacy and housing reforms within the city of New York. And if you've taken a class with me, you know that I find incredible inspiration from Holly White, William H. White, who in the middle of the last century used the best computation and technology at the time, Super 8 cameras and graduate student researchers, to see how people use public space. So you can see here measuring how people occupy Seagram's Plaza. And this opened up a lot of avenues in thinking about what you can do or how people use space, how people occupy street corners, how people interact with each other. Where do people stand when they talk to each other? And this led to projects like, kind of Bryant Park's kind of use of the chairs where you can kind of move around. Partially because some of the findings were, well, when people sit, and I don't know how many of you did this, it's a little bit harder in these rows, but next time you're out or watch kind of in public space, how people sit down, most people will just kind of adjust the chair a little bit before they sit down, orienting to the sun, maybe orienting to other people, but claiming their own territory and space, finding these little aspects of humans in public space. So if you've taken some of my classes, I'm thinking about how we record space and its implications on design, much like how Holly White did it. But very pragmatically, in my old office, I would look out to Avery Plaza and, just how people occupy those spaces. And I was thinking about computer vision at the time. And to open up kind of the conversation for like, what are the measurements, what are the tools, and what are their potential limitations in urbanism? Critiquing and questioning what the tools were available to us. So kind of very reductively, most computer vision algorithms out there do one of really four things. They detect you as a blob. So it's just like something in front of a background, usually a thing that moves against a thing that doesn't move. And we've done this a long time in cinema with like green screens, blue screens that make it very easy. We track you. So we then kind of draw you, and we've done this in some classes, you have that heat map where you find the trajectories. Really hot right now with computer vision is that we try to draw a box around you and figure out what you're doing. So we do box classifications based on a certain relationship of pixels. It's likely that you are jumping, skipping, dancing with some probability. And increasingly in other fields like robotics, trying to do a skeleton. And of course, when we think about those technologies in urban space, they're trying to enumerate, but what are they selling in what they understand? And if we think about what we care about urbanists, it's not just that you walk down the sidewalk, it's why you move down the sidewalk. It's the Clifford Garrett's kind of thick description. I don't want to know what you're doing, but why you're doing it, or how you're doing it, or what are the nuances of what you're doing. So what are these companies trying to do, recognizing that there are computational requirements? So this was fun. This is looking at urban tech. But I think what becomes really as a space of questioning, and really, I think, a pivot point for me in thinking about what is my space in urban technology. So we ran very simplistic images through, what is it? ImageNet. No, that's not right. I'll find the library. It's been a while since I've looked at this. But we ran it through, and we also asked people to very simplistically describe what each of those photos are doing. And because we talked to a bunch of really smart graduate students from Columbia, oftentimes we got really, really nuanced descriptions, like two people with coffee cups talking, one of them like holding at a slight angle, which is probably saying that it's empty. We're like, no, it's more simplistic. What do you see? Oh, two people drinking with coffee in their hand. Okay, great. So these are maybe definitions that we in this room would ascribe. So then we asked the algorithm to describe what you see. So in some cases, it does pretty well, sitting, talking, resting. And then the cool thing about this algorithm is that then it actually identifies some type of what it assumes as a semantic description. So based on the probability, the relationships of this, and this is how ChatGPT works with finer grain, and we can talk about that later, but really it's looking at the relationship between things, seeing if there's a probabilistic relationship, and then ascribing a meaning based on its knowledge. So sitting, talking, resting is what it's identifying. So therefore, people bench outside. That's the meaning. Well, it kind of missed the whole point about coffee. So then we looked at the next one. People sitting individually looking at their mobile phones, which is also called every day on Columbia's campus. So shivering, yeah, we can kind of see with the codes. Speaking, absolutely not. And mourning, which is really sad. And what is kind of the relationship between this? Probably nothing, so just gave people bench. But if we are urbanists looking at this, do we care about the bottom, especially man, finger outside as a description? Or do we care about people eating ice cream together? And the problem is, right now, there is no way with the libraries and tools out there to get to the top. Why? And if I had more time, we'd treat this as a class, and then we begin to kind of interrogate why. Frankly, we don't have an urban data set. We don't have data on sitting. We don't have a data set where we can train a model based on what urbanists care about. The people who are developing those tools, those libraries, are caring about the reductive things. They care about people bench outside. So what happens when we begin to use these tools in enumerating the urban environment, going back to this? What is missing in a lot of this? Especially when they don't think about this. So just that's kind of why I'm like interested is that then I said, okay, to myself, why don't we produce a whole kind of annotation of just sitting? Right? Why don't we actually create it? Why don't we actually see why people sit and then actually backtrack and actually produce a library about that? I haven't done that yet. And most actually of these projects, I'll say, aren't done. They're all in progress. If you're interested in sitting, talk to me. But I think that it actually opens up a specific thing. Like this question of like, why isn't there a library that we can train models on urban sitting? Actually then poses problems when we think about, well, what do we talk about? Health. What do we talk about? Demographics. What do we talk about? Equity. What do we talk about? Representation. We're missing from many of those cases, not because some tech bro isn't thinking about sitting. It's that, frankly, they just don't care, or they don't, or it's a blind spot. If it's not monetized, why don't you do it? And that, of course, comes up with facial recognition. So I'll take you back to my time at the University of Michigan. And as kind of Anna described in the proper introduction, I was part of my hire was to help start the urban technology undergraduate program, first of its kind. And if you can actually explain what urban technology is, all of us would appreciate it because we had that exact same problem there. So what you're actually seeing is the very first day of the very first class. So we got this clock. And once you pull the kind of battery protector, the clock starts and it can only count up. And with the battery and everything, it's estimated that the clock will last about 65 years. So what you're seeing is 21 seconds into the start of that program at the undergrads. And literally for these young people, 21 seconds into their undergraduate career. As I said, we're all nerds. But in that kind of issue of what is urban tech at Michigan, myself, Brian, a few others, Brian Boyer being the head of the program, had some values, but it's just like, how do we embed that into a university culture that may not be welcome with that, or when the questions and resolutions are not quite complete? So we felt for ourselves that it's important to build, to make. And that's kind of the value why if you're in my urban sensing class or you've had in the past, you know, like that's why we're building shit. You know, oh, also I should apologize for my coarseness. If you've taken a class, you know, I very casual how I speak. Because like when you build something, you learn about the pitfalls and problems. It's easy to wag your finger at someone else claiming bias, but when you make it and you realize that that small decision you made to get an assignment done has now built in additional bias, you now recognize and now you can think about how do we overcome that? Why is there that bias? What is that bias? Well, I made that choice. Can I change it in the next step? And what are those reflections? Feeling that that's important for students, but then also like, how do we make this public? How do we open this to the community to actually voice their concerns? How do we work with, you know, a layperson to actually describe what facial recognition is? And then also smoothing out the bureaucracy to build, to demo, and to prototype. If we're going to sense the school, how do we actually do that in a way that IRB feels comfortable? And these are not easy. And for Brian and I, we said, well, at some point, we need to stop theorizing and start actually making. So we wanted to actually run and do a small installation to actually test all of this out. But let me take a pause for a second. And why facial recognition within this program? Why did we pick a very challenging, ethically difficult conversation? A lot of us are very familiar with the picture on the left. And the picture on the right is Detroit's version of Link NYC. So privately owned, privately operated, series of cameras in both. So we see the cameras with the NYPD ones, and then the ones in Detroit, a little bit more transparent than maybe the ones in New York, but still there. So just as a question for a second, blindly, which one creeps you out more? I'm going to just phrase the question as that. The one on the left, raise your hand, run by police. The one on the right, run by some corporation. There's a whole host of reasons why both sides are right. One is we may have some kind of the relationship with the state or relationship with policing is problematic. For others, it's a matter of transparency. The one on the right, I don't know who to complain to. The one on the right, where's the data going? Frankly, one on the left, where's the data going? And that's a challenging question, particularly in Detroit, when this is the map of the policing camera system run by the city of Detroit under a program called Project Greenlight. So this is actually near where I live. For the architects in the room, or former architects, this is the famous Mies van der Rohe development in Detroit, Lafayette Park. So, him trying to make a pharmacy, American programs and beautiful, high modernist architecture, sometimes not as compatible as you want. But by law, if a business were to have a camera participating in Project Greenlight, they must have a literal green light that blinks so that at night, you know that this business is part of the DPD facial recognition system. And there are some challenges to this. One, spatially, is, so this is research done by Rebecca Smith, who I worked with at the University of Michigan. The kind of visibility of the green light in some locations versus where all the cameras are. So for instance, if you're saying on this block, you may be under a camera, but you may not actually see the green light. So there are spatial implications of this. But that this camera system is feeding data into Detroit's real-time policing system, where what happens is those feeds from both public and private sources are fed into an algorithm and does a facial recognition pattern and matches it to an existing database of people who have existing warrants. Obviously, I'm kind of fudging a little bit because I don't know if Detroit has access to Bill Gates's, police picture from his youth or Prince's. But then, by some magic, an arrest warrant is issued for your arrest. Well, there are a lot of challenges and a lot of biases we know in this system. Most notably, we know that there are racial biases in a lot of these algorithms. So to take a step back, and because we're at a university, so I can explain a little bit more. Yes, we know that the data being trained with these algorithms in Silicon Valley have traditionally been trained on faces of males, generally, people identifying as male, and lighter skin tone, predominantly white, Asian, mostly white. But if you think about the long legacy behind the technology, not just what the Silicon Valley bros are doing, but that if you think in the early days when Google was notably as having the most mistakes in the early days and being a pioneer in computer vision and facial recognition, they were ingesting a ton of images into their training data set, into these algorithms. But where was the photos coming from? Well, yeah, they had some digital photos who owned digital cameras at the time, wealthier people in the United States, what racial lines does that follow? But also they were ingesting just the whole of American media. So who tends to be represented in media? Not only that, if you go back even further, photos from Kodak. So Kodak, as the largest kind of photo development company in the United States, provided to developers something called the Shirley card, which is the thing on the left. And what that would do is that you as a developer at your company locally would develop photos and then hold up those photos to Shirley to color calibrate those photos to make sure that the colors were accurate and precise. ... To Shirley. The consequences then are what photos tend to actually have the best contrast versus the photos that tend to get washed out. So now, if you are ingesting into an algorithm to do facial recognition, not only have you introduced bias in your selection of photos that you've curated, think about the entire legacy of photographs. It was only in the mid-1990s did Kodak finally produce multiracial calibration cards. So in the 100-year history of photography, it was only within the last 30 years did we have color calibrations with different skin tones. From the largest photo developing company in the world. And that has real consequences when we go back to the technology. So NIST, the National Institute of Science and Standards and Technology, came out with a report in 2019 finding that Black men are 10 to 100 times more likely to have false positives with facial recognition. And not only that, in the city of Detroit, Mr. Williams, full name Robert Julian Borick Williams, was the first person falsely arrested by the Detroit Police Department, and unfortunately, the first person in the United States to be falsely arrested due to facial recognition. We know there are problems, yet, despite the conversations and debates around privacy, between here, Rashida Tlaib, part of the squad, if you're into American politics, representative from the north of the city of Detroit and its western suburbs, and Police Chief James Craig, having a full-out argument publicly about the system. One arguing about safety, the other one arguing about privacy. Neither of them talking about bias in the data. To then, in the same year, in the front, Mayor Mike Duggan of the city of Detroit, Police Chief James Craig right behind him, and in the back, Nasser Beydoun, head of the Arab American Civil Rights League, standing, promoting and celebrating the 500th camera being added to the system. But wait a minute, we're talking about people who have darker skin tones having kind of challenges, and yet someone who's representing kind of the civil rights of a group is standing there supporting the system. Well, these discussions now get a little bit more complicated because if we think about the ecosystem of people who are opening small businesses in Detroit, who are they? They're Arab American, they're Black, and in many cases, they have said that they feel the confidence and the safety and security to open another business because of this policing system, despite the challenges with the accuracy. So now if we think about kind of traditionally, you know, the racial solidarity or how we think about how these algorithms are being used, our kind of like, you know, maybe a more progressive view breaks down a little bit. And with a progressive city council in the city of Detroit, in 2020, 6-3 renewed the contract with DataWorks Plus. So then we, as two dudes who have lived in New York and moved to Detroit, wanted to engage in this conversation in a very, very small way in thinking about this program for undergrads. So I'll say some of these, I'll say, you know, especially with these algorithms, precision does not equal accuracy, and it certainly does not represent reality. So we did a small installation very quickly. And I'll talk about the ecosystem, but we wanted to play with facial recognition a little bit to have this conversation. So we had an invitation from the Design for Detroit, which is an advocacy group for design and design-based industries, everything from fashion and textiles to movies and film, to do something. So we built this small little installation on the Quick. What you're seeing is the two sides of it. On the outside or the light side is this cute and coy little facial recognition interface where you can walk up and it overlays a cute emoji that we created. It was an ice cream store. So it has this like super coy, happy, ice cream cone. And if the net, emotions over time is positive, digital sprinkles, falls and all that. Oh, so happy. And then on the inside, if you go in, we show you through the gaze of the algorithm and what we call the dark side. So what you see are the last 5 images, actually 6 images, okay, 6 if there's there, of what you see. We identify what we think is your age, your gender, male, female only. And we did that intentionally because we wanted to follow traditional marketing practices. We look at gender, we look at your affect. So we assign to do the cute little emoji. We look at your emoji, and then we capture that over time. How we did this also is that the 6 images are only saved at RAM. So literally when we get another image, the image is flushed. So we don't actually save the images anywhere, but we do keep the patterns over the course of the day. So as people walk up, they kind of, see this, they get this little emoji. That's Brian who was mentioning earlier. And then if you go inside, so this was when we kind of set it up within the school. And in a second, you'll see me in my like cropped hair days. We all had crazy pandemics, I shaved my head. So yeah, and you can see how it kind of updates. So, and we also had like people out there, and I'll talk more about the team in a second. But we also put this up during Motor City Pride. And this is like the anecdote that I think opens up a lot of conversations, going back to the one that I was just mentioning earlier. This group of 4 were stopping in to get ice cream, and they got recognized. And I was able to talk to the first person. And she, although, in her words, yeah, I'm kind of a tomboy. I've always been, but, identifies as female. We were looking at this, so it's like, how do you feel that you're identified as male? It's like, well, short hair, I'm wearing the hat backwards. I personally love, in her way, that I was identified as a child more than anything, and then we were looking at kind of their affect. But then this one was like, so you're like clearly making a commentary about green light, aren't you? And we're like, yeah. And then we're having a conversation about the identification, that it's wrong. And she's like, oh, I don't care. I mean, it's cute that you're showing it. It's kind of fun. I'm glad you did this. I don't know if we would have maybe stayed as long if it wasn't for this project. Uh-oh. As I unplug. So, again. Okay. So then, but then she asked, my worry isn't, about Project Greenlight saying that I'm a boy or I'm younger than I am. I've always questioned, how do they make the decision to make an arrest? And I thought that was actually provocative, because that is actually the question, right? It's not the technology making an assessment. It's the people behind the technology. That is the real issue. Is it not streaming anymore? Okay, thanks. Let me just quickly go back into this. So I think that becomes the real question. How do we assess that? And I'll come back to that in a second. But as I said, there was also kind of like program building. You're seeing very few words that have seen no less than 15 lawyers at one of the largest universities in the country. And this whole project was done entirely almost over Zoom. This was during the pandemic. So this was, we installed in September 2020. So there were a lot of challenges in thinking about how to actually install and build this. And as I said, the initial idea was, how do we kind of make a platform for experimentation? So not only did we find, we have, questions of money, but general counsel, the thing that actually saved us in the end was Saul Berman, the Chief Privacy and Security Officer for IT at the University of Michigan, thought this was just cool because IT folks don't get to be creative. And he's like, can I join your project? So we had a lawyer who joined partially, and this is a separate thing. They joined because they were just interested in the project. They just want to have fun. Most lawyers are not that, happy. But to kind of like join us to think through these policy implications, let alone what does it mean for an ice cream parlor if something goes wrong, right? Are they culpable, right? What if someone gets upset? So this is catalyzed into something that actually, those like last questions I said, is it the technology or is it the people? And what we found is that some people are worried about the technology in different ways, in the same way that at the very beginning, showing those two examples, we all may have different perspectives of what the device is. We all have different perspectives on the people behind those devices. We have different perspectives on the decision-making processes behind it. And how do we make those decisions, especially weighing it against privacy? I was, as part of the Center for Smart Streetscapes, I was at a roundtable with some community collaborators from the Harlem Community Board, their public safety committee. And we were talking first, when we were talking about facial recognition, their primary, at least in the small group, their primary fear is 5G. So it took a little bit to explain what 5G actually is, and for me to make them feel more comfortable that those 5G radio waves have been there forever, and we just switched them from TV and satellites to cell phones. Talk about the giant towers outside of some people's windows, but that's a different case. But then we talk about the facial recognition. They're saying, actually, we're very pro it. We are worried about safety in our neighborhood. When you go to the Upper West Side, that conversation is very different. They're more worried about the police ones than maybe the Google ones, the Alphabet ones. So especially in a city where we have these warnings and disclaimers, what is maybe the relationship we have with this data? What is the kind of the zeitgeist? And what is a relationship with these organizations? What is the epistemology? What is the civic epistemology? And how does that shape our relationship? So invitation, if you are interested in these questions, I'm looking for 2 people to work with over the summer. So the invitation is open to reach out. But I think continuing and thinking about images, and I'm staying in Michigan a little bit more in my own projects. A little other rant. I hate these. If I have a class with you and you're doing these 2 things. One, saying you're using Street View and segmentation, computer vision, doing any type of segmentation, one, and you're arguing that has any relationship with walkability. I will shut that conversation down for one simple reason. This is where the invitation is to think like urbanists. And I have done this literally with CDP. I did this 3 weeks ago at a midterm. How many of you walk down the middle of the street on a regular basis? All right, I see 2 people. You don't get an experience of urbanism from the middle of the street where the Street View camera goes. Most of you get the perspective from over here or over there. So like thinking about this, like the tools that we have are powerful with computer vision. But if we're just gonna say that this is like related to like happy walkable communities, I'm gonna challenge you a little bit. But to think about bigger issues and thinking about this. I've been working on a project for the past 1.5 years on issues of racial violence. So I got a grant as I was heading out the door at Michigan, and I've continued here from Columbia, where we've been looking at the Asian American population in southeastern Michigan, bookended in times of racial violence. The 1980s, notably with the murder of Vincent Chin, and Stop Asian Hate more recently. But Detroit has had a long history of kind of racial segregation, racial problems. The picture on the left is the only remaining marker or aspect of Detroit's second Chinatown. The first one was torn down in the 1930s to make way for a highway, one of America's first highways. So our issue with highways and racial aspects date as long as we've had the car in the United States. To then just very recently to the An Liang building, which is actually, if you're looking at this totem, about right here, was torn down in the middle of the night by a couple of billionaires, and I lost the image again. The Illiches, who own the sports stadium and own Little Caesars Pizza, wanted to expand their developments, and in the middle of the night, tore down a building that the city had marked as historic. But it's not just kind of the physical, spatial violence, it's also issues of data collection. So for this population, a question of erasure and invisibility, where only in the 1960s and 70s did Asian Americans actually become codified in the American census. So I don't have to show you the years, and frankly, I don't care. What you're looking at is the population count according to the US Census. And a lot of times it's just blank. It's because we didn't record as a country Asian and Asian Americans. We just didn't care enough to measure that. So just as a matter of policy, and it's something that many of us consider as a standard in our uses, doesn't actually count people. So then an issue of invisibility where with the suburbanization of Detroit, the Asian American population has become so diffuse where if we're to look for Chinatowns or where these communities may be, you tell me where they are in this square, right? I don't even have to tell you where it is. It doesn't matter. You can't see them. For those who are familiar, we're looking at Oakland County. And then the other square, you'll see some dots for a strong Bangla population there. And the challenge is that a lot of ways that we're trying to understand are challenged because we're looking at the suburbs. So a lot of our literature and scholarship on ethnic enclaves or ethnoburbs are really coastal. We've documented very well in California. We've documented very well in the East Coast, but the American Middle, we don't have a lot of scholarship on. I keep losing the image, and I'm not bumping anything. In the American suburbs. So you tell me when you see Chinatown or kind of the place, the location of Asian Americans. So we've turned to Google Street View because, so this is a kind of a progression over time of a single building. For those not from the United States, welcome to most of America, right? But there's some interesting things from this kind of development of the strip mall. Not only is there a new building, which, yeah, we can get like, we have building outlines and all that, but really watch on this image. But there's a Cricket Mobile and empty storefront that becomes Bosna Grill and I need the name from my slides, 10-second rice noodle, which we can perhaps assess as being an Asian, a culturally Asian kind of facility. So we're using Street View right now. So thanks to also Kavya, who's not here, who's also helping with this project. Where we're using Street View to identify the languages used on businesses. And I chose this as a very specific case, Amart. So if you think about a lot of the data sets that we would use to see more rapidly a business, we can perhaps get a POI from Google, but it won't tell me anything. It'll tell me that it's a little market of some sort. But very specifically, when we look at this, there's Bangla written on the signs. So by actually identifying the predominance of different languages, we're actually able to find how people have come in, built their own amenity businesses, but then looking at the change over time. Now, this is an incredibly difficult challenge in a place like Detroit because try to use Street View or kind of the computer vision algorithms on kind of trying to read signs that small. We're actually able to pick some of it up. So one of the reasons why I showed this, it's a town that's an enclave within the footprint of the city of Detroit. But interestingly, it's kept its population throughout the decline of Detroit, largely because of immigrants. First Polish, and now a Bangladeshi population. So we're actually calibrating some of these models here, and then this area, this area here, which has a large Middle Eastern population, so kind of the predominance of Arabic, and trying to use this to identify a community that's there. But as I said, there's been a challenge, and this is kind of perhaps the most incomplete because we're just beginning this project. We've been talking to different community groups and folks. It's interesting because like you go to Chinatown, New York, and you look at the cultural centers, and they have kind of like a vaguely historic look to them. You might have like the curved roofs. The Chinese Cultural Center of Detroit is in an old Chi-Chi's restaurant. So if you're American and you remember Chi-Chi's Mexican, this is the type of environment. But why? And what does that signal? Why did you locate there? And many times, this case of Vincent Chin has come up, who was murdered. He was an Asian American who worked for the auto industry, but during the time of racial tensions, especially with the rise of the Japanese automakers in Detroit, he was murdered because of his race. And the two people who killed him got off due to a technicality of the law. And that really kind of galvanized kind of a civil rights movement, a pan-Asian civil rights movement in the United States. But we've been collecting kind of how people have formed communities, especially in a time of racial violence. How do you find solidarity? So thinking about these other algorithms and these tools, one project we're trying to do is actually train a language model to have an interactive experience with you so that you could live through the shoes of a person. So kind of a real-time game inspired by the lived experiences of people. The challenge is, technically, and I won't go too much into it, is that it requires semantic knowledge to constrain these language models. And if you want to follow an arc, like I need help, where do I go for help? And to understand that and to take you to the next thing, it needs to understand help and needs to know okay, this is where to go. And you said, go call the police. It has to understand police, but follow a story arc because we want it to be constrained to the lived experiences of these individuals. And the other thing that we found was really interesting is the importance of Chinese restaurants in Detroit in galvanizing the civil rights movement in Detroit. So the Nation of Islam, the conversations that started the Nation of Islam started not at this restaurant, but at a Chinese restaurant at Hong's on the east side. And how do we capture this, especially when many of these venues, so this is one of the most notable old Chinese restaurants from Chinatown, but that's what it looks like on the interior. We have no archives and no records. And if you talk to the families, so we talked to Curtis Chin, who's recently just come out a book about this building. There's no photographs of the interior. So we literally have no memory. So how do we digitally even reconstruct what the memory is as a space of reconstructing historic sites of racial solidarity? So how does then the digital technology kind of supplement the qualitative aspect and create a memorial out of that? And I think thinking about those stories are important. And so the last project I'll talk about is one that we're also doing now and thinking about kind of the idea of narrative, but maybe data narrative. So this is maybe going back to quantitative. And something I've been thinking a lot about, and you can see that there's perhaps a little feminist tinge in a lot of how I'm thinking about the data. And perhaps the most oriented is this one, where I'm thinking not of data as just like something large, something disconnected, but actually something that's tied to the body and the lived experience. The idea of embodied data, because when we think about, for instance, air quality, we always think about something like this. This was last summer, many of you were here for it. Or we think about it at the scale of this. So, we talk about environmental justice a lot. I'm not going to go into it. But the issues is that it's not just a spatial aspect. It's a lived experience about that. That how you move through the city mitigates or exacerbates your exposure. So partially, I'm a runner, or I try to, I'm not right now, but like my exposure to the air is much higher than someone who drives. So although there are complexities, for instance, Asthma Alley in the Bronx, right? How do people actually move through and experience it? A person who's next to the bus stop has a very different experience than one who's in a car. So one thing I've been thinking about is then the idea of kind of the data collection of experience, large amounts of data, but of a few people, thinking about a subject and trying to collect everything about them. So I'll just talk about kind of two cases with that. So one was with the New York City Marathon. It should be the best day for air quality. Roads are closed, fewest cars. It's an extreme case, 5 boroughs, and certainly respiratory rates are super high. The interesting thing is, so this is with an N of 2, and I'll talk about the problems of that. So with this map, well, first the green, you can kind of see the route of the marathon through all 5 boroughs. The areas of red were areas that are historically disadvantaged areas. The red dots are the air quality sensors in the city. Most important part, though, is this. So the official measurements of air quality are the kind of the solid points. And this is based on the exposure rate of 2 people, myself and another person. So there's some autoethnography in this. So, one you can pretty much see that in all cases, the actually breathed experience on the ground had worse air quality, higher exposure to PM 2.5 than the official measurements. And you can see where someone crosses a big avenue because you see the spikes. And that's where you have the issues of exposure. So now we're actually seeing a conflict between the sensor in the sky, how we measure air quality traditionally, and the lived experience of people. And then if you actually put this into the models of exposure, like actual harm to the body, looking at heart rate, at no time for anyone running the marathon in the day with the fewest cars, is it ever healthy to run in the city of New York? So that's pretty surprising that it's not just there are some areas that have environmental justice issues. It's everyone potentially has environmental justice issues because we don't want to have those conversations. Well, this is an N of 2, right? How do you know which one's right? One has much spikier lines and one has not so spiky lines. Yeah, that's the problem with only having an N of 2. There was supposed to be an N of 3, so you can kind of validate. But he twisted his ankle the morning of, and his sensor sat in his living room. So I could show you the air quality of his living room. So actually this summer, the hope is that we scale it up into neighborhoods that we actually kind of know there might be challenges. So partially because the experience of a lot of people is this. It's great if you get access to like the riverfront parks, but a lot of neighborhoods, this is Washington Heights. This is actually how they run, like in the street. So if that's a lived everyday experience, then we have some real challenges. So for me, thinking about maybe this mesospace with this different space of data, not only kind of a feminist approach of embodied data, breathed data, you know, that our lungs, our body, the kind of meat actually, you know, interfaces with, but breaking away from maybe the small, like traditional way that we think about data, you know, the qualitative, which we do get a lot, and there's a lot that's great with it. And there are challenges with big data, maybe opening up kind of the idea of that data anecdote, big data on a few people. The narrative, the data narrative of one or a few that actually begins to reveal something. Because I think you don't get to see. It's impossible to survey and surveil the entire population for your lived experience of air quality. We rely on the sensor and a stick for a reason. But we're now actually able to identify that there are challenges between the sensor on the stick and the lived experiences by going to this different scale, to look at it different and to be intentional with it. So that's all to say all of this, and if you've taken one of my classes, this is embedded in the way I teach. How do you build? How do you make? How do you test? How do you build a new measure, right? So these are just pictures from different classes, you know, from thinking about, you know, how to regenerate. I forgot what this project was. You know, thinking about, I guess we're clustering something. I don't know. It's been a while. We're clustering something to measuring air quality. So Jade, you know, was the first one to measure the 14th Street busway of the air quality. She was walking it every day to Columbia, so she recorded. To then also thinking about different ways that we can kind of sense ourselves in our environments, both at Columbia and abroad. So that's all I've got. So I'll end with this happy picture of Chunky and Zaydan, my friends, robot animals. As a way of saying thank you. And the invitation is to continue the conversation as I personally think about these questions, but also recenter ourselves around maybe questions that we actually care about in this room versus maybe this disembodied view of data. So thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, and yeah, we are ready to open up the questions. Question, I'm really curious if how you're talking about like how garbage is collected data and how like people who are in academia and questions like related questions, you know, a lot of like how the private companies are approaching this data collection and when there is any conversation happening between like academia and private sector companies.
Yeah. So the question is of data collection by private companies and its use in academia or otherwise. I think like my challenge is that I think we as urbanists, and I have been in many conversations where we are very quick. So when I was at actually yeah, you wouldn't have. I was like thinking, have I had any other PhDs when I taught urban informatics? So the P word comes up a lot. And I used to have anyone, so if you know American football, whenever they throw the flag, like there's a flag, like the referees throw a flag and gameplay stops. I used to actually do that because it was kind of the word that would stop all gameplay in a class because we'd interrogate what it means. And so going to the question of the private data, we use it. A lot of people use it. A lot of people in this room have used it for assignments, being Google or RefUSA, which is now, I guess, Data Axle, some of your social media data and all that. It's produced for a purpose. And it has a lot of value, but we have to recognize it's secondary data. We don't have control or authorship over it. So we're using it opportunistically. So there's an old paper of mine that we talk about intentional versus opportunistic data collection and its uses. So opportunistic, we're using it just kind of like, and we hope that something good is happening. Now, there are biases in there, but we have to recognize it. There are opportunities in it. So much like I'm using Google Street View, right? There are challenges. It's built for a purpose, but it's a great archive. And we're trying to hack our way through to use it as an archive over time of amenity businesses and languages to identify population centers. But I think we have to acknowledge that it's also incomplete, but it also has opportunities. And I think, but the reason why I say the privacy thing is that we use that as a way to say, well, there are problems. But what are the problems? Like, and the reason why we would stop gameplay in the class is, what do you mean when you say privacy? Is it that it's creepy? Is it that it's being used for a purpose, for a purpose other than the one that was intended? Is it an issue of transparency? Is it that it's incomplete? Is it that it's data collection is one that you don't know? All of that is privacy. But I bet if I surveyed you all on privacy, we come up with a different value set for what we care about. So I think for us, that's what we need to think about. What are the worries that we have? What are the opportunities that we have? And if you don't like it, do something else. Like let's actually get into the space of authorship because it's so easy now to do that. I was doing university stuff as well. Yeah, we'll see if that actually ever happens. The project. Stephen Ross is behind it, so many New Yorkers. There's a lot of things at the University of Michigan named after Stephen Ross, so including the business school. So billionaires get their way a lot. So that has been contentious. So private businesses have been joining largely because of this kind of sense of security. A lot of universities or public institutions have not, including the cultural institutions. The other side is the cultural institutions tend to be places where, traditional, crime or issues of safety are a little bit different, right? This kind of like the civicness lends a certain perspective. I think that they're trying to avoid it, but that little totem, the kind of link-esque thing is out in those areas. So, and those are connected, but those are independent of those institutions. But, I think that they're avoiding it. They can also afford their own private security. So it's a much more contentious thing. But you go outside of the downtown bubble, and even within the downtown bubble, they're everywhere, including around the sports stadiums, which is adjacent to the downtown area. Detroit is a very weird place with a lot of weird, contentious things happening around the police. But it's, kind of at the forefront, partially because a lot of cities are doing facial recognition. NYPD neither confirms or fully denies their uses and what they have access to. But the fact that it has to be made transparent through the green light has made it much more visible than other places. And in a city that is historically, it's the biggest minority city in the country by like percentage of minorities. Especially like recent things, protesting and rallies
people wear masks.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could share about reducing what it looks like post-pandemic versus before, how many infections.
Yeah, so question of like a lot of things have changed with facial recognition post 2020 because of mask wearing and how may that may shift the conversation. I think the thing that actually worries me, and going back to the P word on all those check boxes that I said, is a lot of states are now trying to do data fusion. So they're taking a lot of different data sets and putting them together to identify you. One thing that is very difficult, I'll say, too, is like whenever you watch a policing film and it's just like, can you locate someone using their cell phone data? And then like all of a sudden, like someone in a real-time control room, it's like, we found them, it's triangulated. They're in this neighborhood, they're in the street. That is incredibly difficult and takes a long time. It is actually very difficult and incredibly messy. So if you've taken like my urban mobility class, you know that actually even very precise GPS data is very hard to use. But they're trying to do it. They can't get that, but there are other things that they can get in real time. So there are conversations on how to encrypt so that to prevent it, partially because the companies that have the data don't want to do it. It's taxing. It's a lot of people. Every police officer in the country was asking for Google data every time. How many people do you need to have in that bureaucracy? So they're encrypting it partially so that they can say to you, it's encrypted, it's private. It's also, they don't want to deal with it. And if they encrypt it and make it really hard to access, few people are going to access. And you can't do it in real time. So, but there have been efforts in trying to do that with location data. Location data is hot right now. No one can figure out how to make money, but it's incredibly hot and they're selling it to everyone. You have access. Actually, I think right now, Colombia is negotiating an agreement with one location data company so that we could use it for research. It's anonymized, it's all of that. You know, it's really coarse. It's really bad. You know, it is. It's really bad, but because they're all just trying to figure out how to make money off of this, right? But with the sophistication that the governments have, they're doing it. I'll say the other side is that in other countries, so that's an American and maybe Western conversation, and the European Union has actually kind of put in a lot more safeguards. The US is woefully behind. We haven't passed any privacy or technology laws in like 30 years, since like HIPAA, you know, and that's when also we had like Section 230 if you're into those conversations, right? It's decades, since the 90s, since Bill Clinton was president. So Europe is trying to do it, but some other countries, they find opportunities. You know? And the regulations with companies, we don't have any currently laws, no cities necessarily bar all actors from doing. So City of San Francisco bars the government from doing it. It does not bar private companies. Oh no, sorry, they bar private companies. They don't bar the government from doing. You go to Disney property, they're implementing right now facial recognition, so you can enter the turnstiles without using a ticket. Make it so your annual pass, you can just go in whenever you want, making it a barrier-free experience for you. Universal Studios has that, right? I just use TSA, you know, using facial recognition. Do it because they have my data anyway, so might as well get something out of it. That's my honest opinion. They have my data. They have it from passports. I have TSA pre-check. They have my travel itinerary. They have it all. I might as well get some modicum of use out of it versus them just getting all the benefit. Save me 5 minutes or something. But I do think that they're getting around it because people have gotten smart. There are a lot of really cool in the hacker community, as in like small h, a lot of interesting work on how to get around facial recognition or camera identification. There's a fashion company from Italy that was at Fashion Week this year that had like anti-facial recognition clothes, from the patterns of the weaving to having infrared reflective threading to do really interesting things. But you look at it, it's just a beautiful sweater. So people are also moving into that space. But you go to China, it's a very different, you know, epistemology. They have a different relationship with the state, different relationship with data, you know, and that all manifests itself in a different kind of use case. I hope so, because we need to change it. That's why I think like having more authors in the room, right? Because if it's not like
our data that's being used, as in like planners, urbanists, some tech company, one of the other big use cases for all these like location companies, like computer vision, all of that, is that they're all talking about how we're going to make better public space. And it's always an enumeration of where people walk so we can reduce frictions. I don't care about how many people walk on the sidewalk over a unit area of time. Yeah, that's important. If it's crowding, that's a problem. I care about actually maybe the inverse of throughput. Maybe when people slow down. Like an anecdote I use is that I don't care that Amazon tells me the book or the product I'm most likely to buy. That's not what I want. I want the algorithm to actually tell me something I would have never found on my own that's going to change my life. That's what happens at a bookstore. They're a bookstore. That's how they started. Give me an algorithm that does that. Same thing with urbanism. I don't want the algorithm that says, or the tools to say, 15 people walk through at 2 feet per second. I want to know, oh, does this place bring joy? Does this space lend people to turn their head, notice something beautiful in the storefront, and go in and find something that's going to change their life? Or have they found love? Or do they want to have lunch here? We don't have algorithms to tell us, did they find something that just changed their life? And now I don't know how to do that, but I think that's a vision that we should have for ourselves, because that's what we want from cities.
I know there's other projects, but I'm thinking about the Chinese restaurant in Detroit, versus the later public of the medical spaces in Florida.
Yeah.
The former, this idea of technologies, for me, that's adjacent to the
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm wondering how you're bridging kind of that gap of this perspective of technology versus a very personal, individualized data universe.
Yeah.
Of self.
Yeah. I mean, so I'll say, like with the restaurant one, we're using the language of art and like installations as a way of kind of having deeper conversations. Like we're using it as a mask to actually archive. You know, the fact that like we're actually trying to archive like where they are to open up spaces for alternative epistemologies, alternative narratives. That instead of saying, let's put the plaque in front and say, this is it, right? Like there are lived stories and experiences that go beyond the building, particularly in light of now kind of development. There are development interests coming in. How do we maintain that? And does it need to live virtually? Especially because everyone who's involved is going to die. Like literally right now, like we are racing against the clock. That people are, it's a generation that is passing. So how do we begin to record some of those narratives, both important and small? And we think that a way to make it relevant is through some type of digital archive of qualitative data. So I think where they're both similar is that we're using the digital tools to open up space for additional data types. So yeah, like we're recording audio, we did that, but we found a lot of other stuff. So what do we do with that and how do we transform that? And how do we think about it spatially? And then the kind of individual is opening the space of like, try to argue. So one of the challenges with like citizen science projects is that if you get like a really curmudgeon-y person in public health, they'll be like, oh, is it validated? Right? As a way of just shutting down the conversation. Versus saying, actually, so the thing that we're doing is that we're validating the data, you know, for the summer. Like right now, we literally like one test is that we have like medical grade sensors, wearable sensors to just calibrate with smartwatches and like heart rate monitors and all of that, just so we can say, yeah, it's validated. And you look in the public health space that's using smartwatches, they have to do it every time because no one believes them. Some curmudgeon's always going to say it. So I'm having to, with kind of like my collaborators, validate to then say, we're looking at individually, try to argue against me. Because I have validated individual data to say this lived experience through the anecdote is opening a conversation around justice that we could not do otherwise. But try to challenge me on validation because I am doing the same thing that you would do. Right? So the sensors I chose are ones that have been calibrated by the EPA, you know, and NOAA, and like the body sensors have been validated to like certain protocols so that we can have that conversation. And so in a way, it's trying to talk through two sides, two different scales, but to open up a space for other data. And I think if you went to like Eyal Weissman's talk, you know, around counter mapping, it's the same thing, using these tools to create space for alternative narratives. into this space. I didn't want to bring up like counter data, counter narrative, because I think that we just kind of go way off in the conversations. I really want to ground it on like specific things.
Yeah, this is gonna be really tough, but it's a lot. I want to know what you think. Is there a way of reconciling the empowering nature of participatory data creation with the fact that it like inherently brings up vulnerabilities in the community that's creating and probably offering up their data to some collective source? I know a lot of rhetoric is like, oh, anonymity will solve this.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical.
Yeah, there's no such thing as anonymity. Truly, I mean, a study from 2000, Tanya Sweeney, some call her like the godmother of privacy. She just using 3 data points can computationally guess your social security number with 80% accuracy, 80 something percent. I'm making up the number, it's like in the 80s. Your gender at birth, your age, and your zip code, which all 3 you can get from voter rolls. So, you know, anonymity and privacy is dead. Generally, we can identify you so easily. You're unique. And there's a class, differential privacy, over at engineering that talks about it through different lenses. So, but I think that the other aspect is I have been, the reason why we're sitting down with community groups this summer is a lot of people are saying, or people have said as a critique, people, groups, researchers, everyone's extractive. We're taking data from the community. It's bad, yada, yada. I don't know if that's true. I honestly don't. Because like then my challenge is, you know, and I've sat down with, you know, some of my colleagues who've written big books. They're, you know, more senior than me. And it's just like, you're right in a theoretical sense. That's all really scary and bad. But on the ground, everyday uses, are people that afraid? And I've never gotten actually a good, it's always back to, well, it could, or we've seen these like risks, or we've seen these things, but it's just like, we don't have actually good community sentiment, and we don't have common definitions. So even in Pew polls, when they look at it, one of the challenges, and they've recognized as a critique, is everyone has a different definition of what you're talking about. They can't survey, you know, in like, what is your worry? They're worried about privacy, but they have no definition, common definition, and they don't have time to tell. Are people worried about Meta? Yeah, but what about it? You know, there might be a few, but now we get to like Link NYC and like policing. It becomes a little bit more difficult because I think that there's, I don't want to say like education, right? Like that's a wrong term, but I think that people have different reference points. So one of the questions is like, based on that, is it about the technology or is it about the people and the power structures in both private and public spaces? And I don't know if we have like a good measurement of sentiment on that. So I honestly don't. You know, I've tried looking for like really good scholarship on that, and I haven't, or public polls or something like that. And I think it's actually meaningful, I think, to sit down with people who are being surveilled, to ask them, to tell them, this is the way you're being surveilled, and how. Do you have a problem with facial recognition in a grocery store where they currently have camera systems measuring? Like, you know, and that's something that people don't think about. We always talk about the government, and it's that different. Much like you all, some of you had bigger worries about one of the totems versus the other totem. And we all may have different reasons, but you know, what is it? And I don't know, but I think it's actually worth asking. And granted, you know, we can't ask everywhere. I wish I had the resources of Pew or Gallup, but I think we can at least look in our own backyard for a place that has had challenges. And how does it differ between neighborhoods or populations or seniors versus people who are digitally native?
Thank you for your great presentation. We appreciate you taking the time for having this talk. And thanks for everyone to attend today's lecture. So please join us next week on March 26th at the same time for Modern Future, Potential History University of Chicago. And she will be talking about slavery, the integrated